Pastor David sat alone in his dimly lit study, the sound of a ticking clock filling the silence. His Bible laid open on the desk, yet its words felt distant, almost foreign. Tonight, like countless nights before, he found himself battling a shadow he thought he did left behind. A battle that seemed impossible to win. David was respected in his congregation. His sermons were passionate, his prayers were fervent, and his advice often sought. Yet behind the pulpit, he carried a burden that felt too heavy to share. A habit that had taken root in his youth and grown into a haunting presence. Masturbation was a word he dared not utter, even to himself, but it was a reality he faced every day. When he was younger, David had prayed earnestly for deliverance. He fasted, wept, and made countless promises to God, only to find himself slipping back into the habit. As the years passed, shame and guilt began to erode his faith in himself, even as his ministry grew. In an effort to find stability, he decided to marry. Esther was a kind and God-fearing woman, and for a while their union brought him peace. But as the years wore on, intimacy in their marriage became rare. Esther, burdened with the stress of raising children and managing their home, often turned away from him at night. David tried to understand, but the rejection stung. In his loneliness, he fell back into old patterns. Now, every Sunday, as he stood before the congregation, preaching about purity, self-control, and the power of God to break chains, he felt like a fraud. How could he tell others to overcome sin when he was drowning in it himself? One evening, after yet another hollow attempt to pray, David reached his breaking point. He knelt on the cold floor, tears streaming down his face. God, I have tried everything. God, I have tried everything. I can't fight this anymore. I feel like I'm losing myself, my family, my ministry, everything. Please show me a way out. As he sat in silence, an unsettling thought entered his mind. You can't do this alone. The next morning, David sought out his mentor, Pastor Isaac, a retired preacher who had guided him during his early days in the ministry. It was the first time David had ever opened up to anyone about his struggle. His voice trembled as he spoke, his shame laid bare. To his surprise, Pastor Isaac listened without judgment. David, he said gently, the enemy thrives in secrecy. You are not the first man of God to face this, and you won't be the last. But freedom begins with honesty, first with God and then with others. You need accountability and professional help. David resisted at first. How could he, a respected pastor, admit to his congregation or his wife that he needed counseling? But deep down, he knew Pastor Isaac was right. David took the first step by seeking a Christian counselor who specialized in addiction. Through counseling, he began to understand the roots of his habits, loneliness, stress, and unresolved emotional wounds. He also learned practical tools to manage his urges and triggers. Next, he sat down with Esther. It was one of the hardest conversations of his life. He confessed his struggles, his feeling of rejection, and how it had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. Esther, though hot, listened with compassion. Their conversation opened the door for healing in their marriage, and together they committed to rebuilding their intimacy. David also shared the struggle with a small trusted group of fellow pastors. For the first time, he found strength in vulnerability. Their prayers, encouragement, and accountability became a lifeline. Months turned into years, and while the journey wasn't easy, David began to experience real freedom. He still faced moments of temptation, but now he knew he wasn't alone. His sermon changed too. He no longer preached from a place of perfection, but from a place of grace, acknowledging his weaknesses and pointing others to the God who carried him through. One Sunday, he stood before his congregation and shared his testimony. Not every detail, but enough to let people know he had struggled and found hope. The response was overwhelming. People who had hidden their own battles came forward, seeking prayers and support. David realized that the shadow he had fought for so long wasn't just his enemy. It became the very thing God used to bring light into others' darkness.